Hi, everyone. We are going to deal today with the newly independent Mexico and their big problem. And their big problem is going to be Texas. Texas is the problem that is going to kind of dominate everything for Mexico in the period between their independence and 1836. That's not to say that Mexico doesn't have a whole bunch of other problems. But I will say that Mexico starts out its independence pretty well in crisis. Now, I'm going to mention this at the start here so that there's no confusion about this. Even though we got Mexico to an independent position in the last class, and we talked about a first president who's going to be the only one who's going to serve a full term, and that kind of took us to 1829 in terms of a timeline. We're going to actually be moving the timeline back and forth a little bit in this lecture. So in the immediacy of getting Mexico to be independent, to become an independent nation, we've got that crisis that I mentioned at the very end. We've got the crisis of the middle class and the conservative views of Agustin Iturbide, the guy who proclaimed himself to be the first emperor of Mexico and dubbed himself Augustine I, and the more populist Enlightenment views of the lower classes in Mexico, embodied in things like the Plan de Iguala and the Plan de Casamata. Eventually, in 1823, the liberal forces succeeded in removing Iturbide and began working toward establishing a more federalist republic. And when I say federalist republic, it's exactly what it sounds like. It is very much modeled on the United States' model of our constitutional republic, where you have a strong national government that works in concert with individual sovereign states. So that's the goal, is to establish something in terms of its framework that's very much like the United States. However, just establishing a government is not the only problem that the new nation actually has, that Mexico actually has. The nation is going to have to deal with handling a very messy economy. We talked a little bit about this in the previous classes. Taxation was not easy. Establishing market forces was not easy. We've also got problems of the desire of military officials and church officials to preserve their standing within Mexican society. And there's also another reality, and this again is kind of dovetails with the United States history. You've got the political inexperience of the new leadership that's playing a role in all of this as well. Now, Mexico, and this, again, I can't emphasize this enough, there are a lot of parallels with the United States history. Mexico also has a major foreign policy problem at the very beginning of its history. They had to defend the North. The North part, the norteños, the people who were living in those areas, they were defenseless. They were, in a lot of ways, they were kind of left hanging out there by virtue of their settlement, by virtue of their proximity to Mexico City. And the new government is going to have to figure out a way to deal with defending the North. And why this matters, especially to us in this quote unquote room in 2023, why this matters is Coahuila y Tejas is part of that northern region. Texas is part of that northern region. And Mexico not only has to deal with the advances of the Comanche, but they also have to deal with the advances from the United States. Okay, Texas had seen an increase in activity by American adventurers, since the end of the 1700s. In 1801, for example, Spanish authorities captured a mysterious agent, a guy named Philip Nolan, and an American who claimed that he was looking for Mustangs, quote unquote, that he planned to sell in Louisiana. He had no official position. Philip Nolan is pictured on the screen here, just below where my head is. Philip Nolan had no official position. I'm sorry, that's James Wilkinson on the screen. I don't have Philip Nolan on this screen. Nolan did not have permission to actually be in Texas, and he was captured around the present day hill country, excuse me, in the hill country. And Spanish soldiers believed that he was part of an American expedition to attempt to capture and acquire Texas for the United States. So they executed him. The Spanish soldiers in the central parts of Texas, they executed Nolan. In 1806, Spain also repelled 2 more American incursions into East Texas. One was a scientific expedition that was absolutely 100% ordered by Thomas Jefferson. He's the redhead pictured here in the sort of in the top right of the screen. That's not a traditional portrait of Thomas Jefferson, but it's likely a more accurate representation of what Jefferson looked like. He was doing this, Jefferson and his advocates for this expedition claimed that it was absolutely necessary to clarify the boundary between the Louisiana Territory and Spain's territory. And I think if you remember back to the last class, I mentioned that Jefferson's understanding of the entirety of the Louisiana area and the connections that the Spanish had with the French monarchy and all of this, it was his understanding that Texas was to be part of the Louisiana Purchase. There was no question in his mind. Jefferson also believed that Florida was supposed to be part of the Louisiana Purchase. So he's ordering this mission to try to clarify what the boundaries were. But obviously, you can figure out that if American scientists protected by American soldiers are trespassing in Spanish territory, Spain looks at it in a very real way as an invasion. So Mexicans are going to look at it in the same way. This mission was evicted largely without incident, or ended. It was ended with the eviction of these soldiers and the scientists by the Royal Spanish troops in what is today Bowie County, Texas. But there was very little incident other than, you guys pack up your stuff and get out of here. The second was an invasion by a U.S. general named James Wilkinson, and that's the guy who's pictured directly below my head in the palm tree here. And it was over the same territory, and it was over the same issue, a disputed boundary. Wilkinson and a Spanish commander avoided a major dispute when they mutually agreed to recognize a neutral ground from Arroyo Hondo to the Sabine River, and that's represented on the screen here in this little map here. This little pale area in the western part of Louisiana, stretching to the eastern part of Texas, that is this sort of neutral ground. This is an area where people from Texas, people from the United States, Spanish people, Mexican people, U.S. Americans, all of these people, they can all go to that area, and there's no danger for being there. But they wind up coming to a truce over this. And it's worth pointing out that Spanish officials were uneasy about this whole issue. And they were uneasy about Wilkinson to begin with, because when Wilkinson took over his position, his official position in the United States military, was that he was the commanding general of the Department of the South, okay, which means he controls everything in the South from a military perspective. He decided he was going to set up his headquarters at New Orleans, Louisiana, which, as far as Spain was concerned, this puts him in the perfect place to launch an invasion into present-day Texas, into Coahuila y Tejas. So they're not thrilled about this stuff. But also, as I mentioned in the last class, Spain's got a lot of stuff going on, and they're more interested in dealing with that stuff. They're more interested in holding on to power in Europe. They're more interested in trying to maintain New Spain than dealing with this kind of little expedition by Wilkinson. Now, in 1819, we're going to see yet another attempt at an expedition into Spanish territory to, again, try to steal Texas away from Spain and from Mexico. This was an attempted invasion by a doctor named James Long, pictured on the screen, and a force of what were referred to as filibusterers. Now, filibusterers are not what we think of in today's parlance when we talk about people in Congress filibustering bills. That's just kind of arguing. Filibusters during this period, these are groups of essentially soldiers of fortune who go out and organize private expeditions to do something on behalf of either themselves or behalf of a client state. Like, James Long is doing this. It's a private group that he's organized and mobilized, but the plan is steal Texas away and get it added to the United States. A group of Natchez businessmen endorsed this action because they were upset over something called the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819, or as it was more popularly known during the era, as the Adams-Onis Treaty. Despite the longstanding belief that Texas was part of the Louisiana Territory, the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819 established the Sabine River as the border between the United States and Spanish Texas. So you can see right here on the screen, if we look at this little map here, this little red area, okay, this is the border. Okay, this is disputed between New Spain and Arkansas, but all of this stuff represents the Sabine River and the area that is not going to be part of the United States. It will remain part of Spain. Now, many Americans took this as a sign of weakness, or at least the strategic appearance of weakness, and decided that they were going to do what was necessary to, quote unquote, and these were Long's words directly, to, quote, reclaim Texas themselves. So the army that Dr. Long put together was basically a small group of mercenaries who pushed into East Texas, but they wound up getting stopped in October of 1821. Spanish troops apprehended Long. They took him to Mexico City. They arrest him and take him to Mexico City and throw him in prison. The big fallout from all of this stuff, obviously, Long doesn't take Texas. Texas doesn't become part of the United States here. But why Long's expedition is so important is because it creates this very deep distrust of Americans, both on the part of the Spanish, who were in charge at that moment, and later Mexican authorities. They're going to distrust Americans for the same reason. They're just going to look at it and say they're all a bunch of people like James Long who just want to take over Texas and separate it from us. Now, the next group of people, Comanches, are also a problem in this area, as the Comanche regularly invaded Texas settlements to try to rustle livestock for trade in firearms with Americans in the border areas. American Southerners were equally enthusiastic traders, as they were more than happy to acquire mules and horses to try to make cotton cultivation easier. So in places like Arkansas, places like Alabama, they were more than happy to trade with Native Americans. Given all of these crises and the raids, many Tejanos thought that opening Texas to foreign settlement would simply be the easiest way to keep Indian devastation to a minimum. Okay, now I want to mention here, by the way, just in case we're not clear about what various terminologies mean, Tejanos, just like when we've talked about Peninsulares and Criollos and all of these different people in the casta system, Tejano has a very specific meaning here. It's not a Texan, okay? Tejano is a person of Spanish descent who is born in Coahuila y Tejas. So, person of Spanish descent, born, Spanish or Mexican descent, born in Texas. Okay, that's how Texans began to look at it. That's how Americans began to look at it. Tejano is people of Mexican descent who are born in Coahuila y Tejas. Now, they looked at the Tejanos looked at this and said very simply, bringing in American settlers is probably the easiest way to deal with the Native American problem. Now, materially speaking, from an economic standpoint, Texas was in very bad shape during this period. Just with Indian raids, it was bad. This economic problem made outside involvement, like immigration, seem to be the answer to every problem in the area. The old Spanish outposts were in ruins by the time the 18 teens rolled around. The settlers who had remained in these areas struggled for basic survival. There were shortages of food, clothing, medical care, and a lot of these people around those missions and around the outposts, these were Tejanos. They were the pobladores that I talked about in the last class. Buildings were in disrepair, fields remained unplanted. So while understanding that there's certainly a danger in letting Anglos into Coahuila y Tejas, in Tejas specifically, many people believed that colonists extended the possibility for economic revival in this area. Even though previous efforts had failed, Tejanos believed that a government-directed plan of immigrants from the United States and from Europe would form a barrier against Comanche raids and create economic development. So Tejanos actually asked for a series of settlements and farm establishments to buffer the outposts of places like San Antonio. Now, while the Tejanos are asking for all of this stuff, for this plan of Anglo migration, Spain had actually already put a plan in place. They had already begun just such an idea. In January of 1821, the Spanish government agreed to a proposal laid out by a guy named Moses Austin, who at that point was a Missourian, to oversee the settlement of American citizens in Texas. According to the contract that Austin got in 1821, he would relocate 300 families from the United States to Texas in exchange for a huge personal grant of Texas land. So Moses Austin, he's the guy on the left here. Moses Austin is going to recruit families, bring them in. He's going to agree to, these are the people we're going to let in. He's going to dole out land to them, and he himself is going to get an enormous plot of land. Now, that's the plan. He makes a ton of money in lead mining in Missouri. However, the War of 1812 wound up, and the subsequent Panic of 1819 had cost Austin everything. This is the first episode that the United States has with an economic crisis, with a depression. So Austin, who had been a fairly wealthy guy, was bust by this point. So this was his way, as Austin saw it, getting this contract to relocate all of these people to Texas. This would be his way back. This would create wealth for him. This would remake him, and he wouldn't have to deal with his creditors in Missouri and all of this stuff. He'll be back on track. Everything's going to be great for him. And everything might have been great for him, except Moses Austin died on June 10th, 1821, before he could actually get any part of the project going. And the contract wound up being assumed, quite literally passed down, to his son, the guy pictured on the right, who's known as Stephen F. Austin. Okay, Stephen F. Austin. Now, the colonists under Austin's contract, many of whom owned slaves, began arriving in the end of 1821. In March 1822, however, the Mexican National Congress informed the governor of Austin, a man named Antonio Martinez, that it no longer recognized the Spanish contract of Moses Austin. So we've got right off the bat, again, some real problems in here. Mexico is not recognizing Spain's grant to Austin. To keep things as they were, what the Mexican government said, Stephen Austin would be required to travel to Mexico City to argue for his claim. Austin, Stephen F. Austin, arrived in Mexico City in April 1822, where he actually witnessed the coronation of Iturbide and waited for 5 months for the new government of Spain to act. What Stephen F. Austin was doing, he was one of many immigration agents or impresario agents, as they became known. So these are the people who are going to be given the prospect of recruiting people to these Mexican lands, particularly in Texas, to allow all of these people to migrate. All of these new impresarios, Austin and everybody else who followed him, all of them lobbied the new government, the Iturbide government, to allow any impresarios to enlist people with slaves to migrate. Okay, so slavery is going to be a big part of this. Anybody who tells you that slavery doesn't have much to do with Texas is absolutely 100% incorrect. Every single one of the impresarios said, you got to let us recruit slaveholders. And it's very simple why. Those who were impresarios believed that only slave labor would be adequately able to convert these Texas lands into productivity. They understood that there was real agricultural potential, but it simply hadn't been utilized to this point, and the only way to do it was through slave labor. Slave labor, would create the productivity. Those supporting slavery were an oligarchy of leading families, merchants, and rancheros. They saw a clear economic benefit to allowing slavery into Texas, in addition to them forming this big shield against the Comanche. So once again, we've got kind of a class issue developing here. The leading people, the upper classes, if you will, in Mexico supported immigration, especially immigration of slaveholders. Okay, that's who those leading families, the leading merchants, the rancheros actually were. People who were pobladores supported the immigration to work as a shield, but they certainly did not like the idea of slavery. Mexico's Congress ultimately passed, in January 1823, they passed a law called the Colonization Law of January 3rd, 1823. It's called that because it's a law that deals with colonization and is passed on January 3rd, 1823. So not terribly imaginative in coming up with names for these sorts of things, but it's an important law that gets passed, the Colonization Law of January 3rd, 1823. It opens Texas to settlement, okay? But it decreed that enslaved people who were brought in must be gradually emancipated. Now, Austin left Mexico City, partially satisfied, but also disappointed because he got part of what he wanted, but he doesn't get everything he wanted. Now, I'm going to kind of spoil part of the show. He's not as disappointed as he would be later in January of 1823 when liberal Mexicans overthrew Iturbide and called for a new Congress. And this new Congress's first act is going to be to declare that all acts of the previous government were null. In short, Austin is back to square one. Finally, in April of 1823, the new Congress of Mexico agreed to Austin's petition authorizing him to bring in families under his original agreement. Now, I want to mention here, I guess I don't have it on the screen and I didn't have it on a previous slide, but there were some important caveats to the original contract. While Austin could recruit all of these people, Spain had put in in their original deal that the people who were coming over under Austin's contracts, they had to practice Catholicism. They were required to learn Spanish, and they were also, quote unquote, required to assimilate into the culture. They were required to assimilate to Spain's laws, and ultimately with Mexico rescinding and then recertifying or restoring the contract. The same things are in place, that Austin is going to have to practice these people are going to have to practice Catholicism. They're going to have to speak Spanish, and now they're going to have to assimilate to Mexican society. These are all part of the contract. Now, when Austin left Mexico City, he was authorized to locate 300 families, but he had to settle another problem right off the bat before he could do any of this sort of stuff. While he was in Mexico City arguing for the restoration of his contract, the original colony that he had left, called Austin Colony, was now just completely destroyed by Karankawa Indians. Karankawa Indians attacked, followed by a massive food shortage. All of these things convinced the original settlers that this was not viable anymore, and they abandoned the colony. Those who stayed in Austin Colony were hopeful that Austin would be successful and that he would return, but there certainly was no guarantee of all of this sort of stuff that he would return. Finally, in summer of 1824, Austin had managed to turn things around enough and return to Austin Colony that he issued a renewed call for colonists. And for his land commissioner, a guy named Baron de Bastrop, to approve a number of land titles. Now, some historians refer to this group of settlers, the original settlers that are recruited after Austin returns. Okay, once Mexico has said, okay, we'll give you your contract back and you can go back up and start recruiting again. Some historians refer to this group of people who come in as, quote, the old 300, the old 300. And you can see on the map here where Austin Colony is actually located. San Felipe de Austin on the Brazos River was the principal colony, about 80 miles from the Gulf of Mexico. It would be 60 miles away from present-day Houston. I also want to make sure that we're clear on this too, that calling this Austin Colony or San Felipe de Austin, whichever term you prefer to use, I just want to make clear that this is not Austin, Texas. Austin, Texas is a completely different place. Okay. Now, when these people are brought in, okay, the colonization laws of Mexico are, again, they're constantly in flux because of the constant problems within the Mexican government, the problems that they're dealing with. Austin is one of many impresarios in Mexico City, but he was the only one following Iturbide's overthrow that actually won approval from the Provisional Congress. So while there were a bunch of other people in the Spanish rule era, while Iturbide had said, yes, you guys can keep your land grants, when Iturbide got overthrown, Austin is it. He's the last one standing, so to speak. So for the most part, colonization occurred under a new, quote, new national colonization law. This colonization law was passed August 18th, 1824. I'm telling you that for, just for trivia's sake. I certainly wouldn't expect you to remember August 18th, 1824. Mexico's Congress passed this while they were still working on a new constitution. So there was not a constitution governing the nation of Mexico at this point. But the new law, the National Colonization Law, established restrictions on colonizing, but left the individual states with complete control of over the immigration and complete control over the dispersal of public lands. So everything is in the hands of the individual states. within Mexico. So Coahuila y Tejas is in charge of telling Austin how this is going to go, not the other way around. The new law also, quote, instructed the states to remain within the limits of the national constitution. For whatever that was worth at the moment, they still said that. It's a tricky provision. The general sentiment, this is why it's a tricky provision, excuse me. The general sentiment in Mexico was clearly one of anti-slavery sentiment. But there was also no clear law that forbid slavery, and certainly no provision in Iturbide's constitution that prohibited slavery. And as I've mentioned on multiple occasions here within the last few minutes, Austin was consciously recruiting slaveholders with the permission of the Spanish and the Mexican government. So there's a real challenge here to be met, especially when there's no constitution in place. The National Colonization Law of 1834, though, excuse me, of 1824, came from Enlightenment era inspired neoliberal federalists within the Mexican government. These were people who thought exactly like the people in the United States did. They thought like the framers of the United States Constitution. They thought like the framers of the Spanish Constitution of 1812 that we talked about in the last lecture. These people in Mexico were called federalists because they advocated concentrating power in the hands of the states. Okay, among their leaders in Mexico were Valentin Gomez Farias on the top of the screen from Zacatecas, and Lorenzo de Zavala of the Yucatan. Those who were favoring a strong central government were the more conservative element in Mexico, supported primarily by the clergy. A lot of landholders supported conservatism. The military supported conservatism. They called themselves centralists. They wanted a very strong centralized authority. But people like Farias and Zavala supported dispersing power into the hands of the states. So once again, you've got this problem here where you've got centralists, and we'll just call them, we'll call them what they called themselves, federalists versus centralists. The liberals, or the federalists, had momentum because of how Iturbide had more or less seized power and declared himself emperor and created this federal constitution. I should probably move back to the last slide. Created this federal constitution of the United States of Mexico, and created all of this stuff. They didn't like that, and the Federalists had the support of the people in arguing that what Iturbide had done was wrong. Now, ultimately, the Federalists in Mexico created in 1824, October 4th, 1824 specifically, they created the Federal Constitution of the United States of Mexico. And this Federal Constitution of the United States of Mexico gave the states control over internal affairs and diluted the power of the national government. So power is not going to be concentrated at the top. It's going to be dispersed throughout the individual states within Mexico. They planned the plan with the Constitution of 1824 was that it would be similar to the United States Constitution, and incidentally, one of the signers of this new Constitution of 1824 was a Tejas ranchero named Erasmus Seguin. So these Tejanos were pretty well important and getting involved in every step of this process. Now, the national government united the old Spanish provinces of Coahuila and the province of Tejas into one state. In 1825, these two separate states are united into one called Coahuila y Tejas. They don't come up with a new name for it. It's just Coahuila y Tejas. It's established in 1825, and the state established a constitutional Congress as a temporary legislature while it drew up a state constitution. Texas, from the Nueces River to the Sabine Rivers, became a departamiento, or quite literally the Department of Texas. And presiding over things in the Department of Texas would be a jefe politico, or a political chief, appointed by the governor of the state. So each department, Tejas and Coahuila, is going to have a jefe politico appointed by the governor of Coahuila y Tejas. This jefe politico would be responsible for the defense of the department, education, taxes, both laying down the taxes and collecting the taxes, census taking, monitoring elections. Now, the new state constitution, the Constitution of Coahuila y Tejas, emerged on March 11th, 1827, and everything that I've just laid out was incorporated into the new Coahuila. This is a mouthful for me, so I'm sorry. Coahuila Tejano government. The state legislature for the new Coahuila Tejano government is going to allow for 2 deputies from Texas and a provision to add more based on growth. So deputies are basically quote unquote congressmen to this region. Now, the state's provisional Congress also decreed their own state colonization law. So I know I'm putting a bunch of quote colonization laws in. I gave you the state of Mexico, the national states colonization law just a couple of minutes ago. Now we're going to be dealing with Coahuila y Tejas's state colonization law. This is their law of March 24th, 1825. And there are going to be a number of goals carried out or represented in this state colonization law. The peopling of Coahuila y Tejas is going to be the main goal. How do we populate this area? There will be an encouragement in this state colonization law, an encouragement of farming and ranching, while simultaneously stimulating commercial activity. So commercial activity at its very simplest, trade. Okay. It again is going to permit the migration of Anglos into the state, but it's also going to seek to push Mexicans into moving north by giving them priority over emigres in land acquisition. Okay, so Austin may have this enormous land grant, but you know, when he brings in settlers, colonists, and doles out parcels of land, he's got to do it from his own gigantic land grant. He does not have the power to just go out and say, yeah, go over there and settle there if it's not part of his land grant. The state of Coahuila y Tejas controls all of that. And the state is saying that while we will permit Anglos to come in, we're going to give priority to people who are from Mexico for that land. So land grants are going to be controlled by Coahuila y Tejas, and they're going to give priority to Mexicans who are emigrating to Coahuila y Tejas. Qualified heads of household could obtain a league of land, or just over 4,400 acres, for grazing, and what was called a labor of farmland, about 177 acres, for the purpose of putting crops into the ground. The law temporarily, the law temporarily suspended tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. The thought was, we want to promote commercialism. Good way to do that is to bring in a lot of imported goods. So we're going to temporarily cease the taxation on those imported goods. And this threw in, at the state level, those things that I mentioned that Austin had to do according to the Spanish and Mexican governments. The state constitution, the state colonization law required that people would essentially practice Catholicism. Now, I say required. There's no explicit mention of Catholicism in the state colonization law. So there's not something in there that says you must practice Catholicism. But people in Texas and people in Mexico, generally speaking, did not practice other religions. So it was just kind of understood that if you're coming to Texas, you're going to practice Catholicism. That's just the way it goes. So there was, while there's no specific mention of Catholicism, it does say that emigres must observe the Christian religion. The law also was vague enough. I want to state this too. It's vague enough that it does not specifically prohibit the importation of slaves. This is why, again, there's a big controversy ongoing, I think, about the role of slavery in Texas and in Coahuila y Tejas and within Mexico more generally, because the laws are, for a long time, comparatively, in Mexico, they're vague about the institution of slavery. Now, that is the Constitution that's created in 1824, the subsequent colonization law, and the state colonization law. What's going to blow all of this apart is the Constitution of 1827, the Coahuila y Tejas Constitution of 1827. This is not a federal constitution. This is a state constitution. It is a whole different story. The constitutional issue, the Constitutional Convention, was led by abolitionists from Coahuila. Abolitionists, just to kind of make sure that we're, again, all on the same page in terms of terminology, abolitionists are more than just, quote unquote, anti-slavery. Abolitionists believe that the government should simply pick a date, and on that date, slavery ceases to exist. There's no gradual emancipation. There's no doing this over time. And I think another big difference between abolition and anti-slavery is the abolitionists believe there should be no compensation to the slaveholders. So immediate uncompensated emancipation. And these are the people who are guiding the Constitutional Convention that produces the Constitution of 1827. Now, an alliance of Anglo slaveholders, Tejano oligarchs, these are a small group of landholders and elites within Tejas, and entrepreneurs argued that banning slavery might hurt emigration from the United States and destroy the labor force. And they were temporarily successful in stopping any sort of anti-slavery prohibition. However, it was only a temporary stop. What the Constitution of 1827 stated is the following. Colonists could import slaves into Texas. As they come into Texas, they're allowed to bring their slaves with them, essentially. However, children that are born to the enslaved, doesn't matter if the parents are slaves, the children are born free. And all enslaved people are to be freed within 6 months of the new Constitution's publication. And in addition to that, the Constitution stated no further importation of slaves into Texas. So all children are to be born free. So when people come in, they can bring their slaves with them, but all children are to be born free once they get into Texas. All enslaved people are to be freed within 6 months of the publication of the Constitution, and no further importation. So a person who owns slaves could come to Texas, But they could not go, I could probably use 10 more slaves, so I'm going to buy 10 slaves from, say, somebody in Mississippi and have them brought into Texas. You can't do that. Okay? You're not allowed to do stuff like that. So there is a short window that will allow enslaved people into Texas. But again, it's a very short window, very small window in all of this. Now, the impresario contracts are the thing that's guiding all of this stuff, the thing that's creating all of the tensions. Since there's such an important part of what's going on, it's worth taking a few seconds to look over what the impresario contracts were all about. Land titles for migrants under the state colonization law could be handled individually or via the impresario, an immigration agent who acted on behalf of the state to select colonists, allocate the land, and see to the enforcement of the laws in the colonies. So, for example, people like Stephen F. Austin, because he was an impresario, was charged with not only maintaining state policy in terms of how the land is actually distributed, he's charged with making sure that people are actually practicing Christianity, that people are learning Spanish, that people are starting to assimilate into society, that they are not importing additional slaves, that they're complying with freeing the laws requiring that they free their enslaved. So the impresario is not just a guy, in theory anyway, not just a guy who's supposed to be handing out land, doling out titles. Okay? Now, the impresarios themselves were paid in land. They were not paid in money. They were paid 5 leagues and 5 labors for every 100 families they brought in. To give you an idea of what 5 leagues and 5 labors is, it's about 23,000 acres. So it's a big plot of land. And it's for every 100 families they bring in. So obviously, the more families you bring in, the more land you're going to get. In 1832, there were 41 impresario contracts under both the National Colonization Law of 1924 and Coahuila y Tejas's own state colonization laws, allowing about 13,500 families to come to Texas. This was the primary way that Anglo-Americans came into Texas. By 1825, Stephen F. Austin was almost finished with his first impresario contract and thus made an agreement with the government to settle 500 families. In 1827, he agreed to settle another 100 families in what is today Bastrop and Travis counties of Texas. In 1828, he completed the first contract. So he's got his original contract in 1821. He's close to completing it by 1825, and it's on those bases that the government keeps giving him these new contracts. But he does not actually get a completed contract done until 1831. He didn't complete it until 1831. So he finally completes that, and he never comes close to fulfilling the other ones. The 1825, the 1827 contract never comes close to completing those, to settling all of those. He used much of the land grants that he got for speculation purposes. He would sell parcels to new arrivals. But before it comes off, before I start sounding like I'm criticizing Austin for doing this, and it's not like he's not worthy of the criticism. I don't want to walk that back or anything. Austin is hardly the only impresario that's doing this. Virtually all of the impresarios did the same things, gaining financially from the largesse that was given to them by Mexico's government, selling lands that they were not really authorized to sell, engaging in speculation, and the like. Other Texas impresarios in the area, other Texas impresarios were people like Green DeWitt with lands between Guadalupe and Lavaca rivers, with a center at Gonzales, Texas. His original contract expired in 1831 with only about a third of the promised 400 families he agreed to settle. Martin de Leon settled to the southeast. This is de Leon on the bottom of the screen here. He settled to the southeast. He was a rancher. De Leon got his contract in 1824 in San Antonio. His grant, however, had very ill-defined borders, which caused a lot of problems with DeWitt's settlers. It was only when DeWitt's land was actually reabsorbed into the public domain that De Leon's colony wound up with any sort of clear borders. De Leon's colony, as settled, was small, but it still had 162 families that settled, centered at Victoria, present-day Victoria, Texas. There were other empresarios who had even less success than these two guys, and these two are not terribly successful. Robert Leftwich, for example, on the far left, received a contract in 1825 for a cooperative venture called the Texas Association of Nashville, Tennessee, with no one colonizing his lands until the 1830s. Hayden Edwards got a contract to settle 800 families around Nacogdoches, but in 1826, he participated in an armed rebellion, which we'll get to later, and the state took away his grant on the basis of treason. So none of these people are doing well in terms of what their job was, which was, quote, populating Coahuila y Tejas. Now, we have to deal with, and when I say deal, we have to start talking a little bit about Native Mexicans of Texas and what's going on with them, because again, they're an important part of this, of why this class exists, and they're an important part of the problems that are going on in Texas. With the settlement of the Anglo contracts and colonists, Mexican natives were seeing a bit of a renaissance in Texas following the war for independence, and I've got a map of Texas up here, you'll see for a reason. There were ranches that were between Bear and La Bahia that were established along the entire stretch on both sides of the San Antonio River. These ranches belonged to wealthy Mexicans of high, or wealthy Mexicanos of high status, such as Martin de Leon, who I just talked about, Juan Seguin of Bear, and Carlos de la Garza of Goliad. In 1823, what we also start seeing is a steady flow of people from southern parts of Mexico into places like Nacogdoches, leading to a revitalization of that town as well. By the 1830s, Texas consisted of a number of small towns surrounded by, Nacogdoches did. Nacogdoches was surrounded by about 50 founding rancheros, and there was a massive ranching frontier spreading from the Rio Grande northward to the Nueces River around present-day Corpus Christi. So this moment, remember when I talked a little bit a few minutes ago about how Tejanos were a big part of saying, look, we need Anglo settlement here for revitalization purposes. It actually worked, and for a period of time, it actually benefited Mexicanos within Texas. Now, things are going to start getting a little bit dicey with regard to the Anglos, because what we're going to see is that they are constantly butting heads with the Mexican government. Anglos began to worry about the Mexican government pretty much from the moment they got into Tejas. Many had actually entered Mexico illegally. They were fleeing debts. They were fleeing law enforcement. Guys like Moses Austin, while he entered legally, okay, and his son Stephen F. came in legally, they were exactly the type of people that were illegally coming to Mexico, people who would become incredibly indebted. Both Austins were in incredible debt in Missouri. And Stephen F. was actually told, if you come back to Missouri, you will be arrested. So when you leave, don't come back. So a lot of these settlers into Texas have the same problems. They are running from debts. They're running from law enforcement in the United States. But that wasn't really the biggest problem. I mean, after all, this is a frontier area. And in Mexico, just like in the United States, you can reinvent yourself in the frontier. That's not really the big issue. So these people are illegally entering, but that's not the big problem. Many Anglo settlers simply did not take their Mexican nationality or their citizenship seriously. Remember, this was a condition for settlement, and they're not taking it seriously. Some had actually built their homes in mostly Tejano settlements and ranchos, but overall, Anglos preferred living away from Comanche hunting grounds to avoid Indian attacks or avoid Indians altogether, which negated part of the reason they were supposed to be there in the first place. Remember, not just economic revitalization, not just plant the area, but also to form a shield against the Indians. And if they're coming in and going, yeah, we're not gonna do that, then that's a big problem. They're negating the whole reason they are there. Another problem was that given their concentration in eastern Texas, these people were a fair distance from Mexico City. And because of that, they lived a near autonomous life. And they did things because of that relative autonomy that made the Mexican government uneasy. Like, for example, squatting on unoccupied lands. So there would be land that was not necessarily assigned to anybody, but was part of the public domain. And these people would just come in and they'd basically set up a claim. They'd start putting crops in. They'd say, well, we planted crops, we built a house, it's our land. So, it's ours. We're here. You have to prove it's not your land. So you have to prove that we don't have the right to be here. And given that the process would entail going to Mexico City, surveying the land, making sure that it was indeed public lands, it was a long, drawn-out process. So they had time on their side when it came to squatting in these areas. Some engaged in illegal commerce. Some would trade with people that they were not supposed to be trading with. Some would apply American solutions to local issues, like speculating in land or dealing with Native Americans, or setting up trade outposts with Louisianans, which they weren't supposed to be doing. The other things that they were doing, and this was a huge problem, was that they were holding slaves in direct violation of the state constitution. Essentially, to put it very simply, they were disregarding the traditions that allowed them into Texas in the first place. Now, I realize that saying this stuff in 2023 should spark a sense of irony in some of your minds. So keep that spark alive a little bit. This all manifested itself in the worst possible way in Nacogdoches in 1826. The impresario Hayden Edwards proclaimed, and that's the guy pictured at the top of the screen here. He proclaimed the region's independence from Mexico over a series of disputes, and he proclaimed the so-called Fredonian Rebellion. The Fredonian Rebellion. There had always been disputes about land titles among the original settlers of Nacogdoches and among Edwards and his colonists. So this was nothing new, this dispute over land colonists. Hayden's brother, Benjamin, was the actual leader of the rebellion, though, and concluded that the only path forward for Nacogdoches, for the impresarios, the only path forward was independence from Mexico. That's the only way to resolve these title disputes. The defeat of the Fredonian Rebellion, and it is defeated, came from a surprising force. Other foreign-born and, to be frank, more successful impresarios and colonists denounced the Fredonian Rebellion. For example, Stephen F. Austin looked at what was going on with the Fredonian Rebellion and said, yeah, this is going to hurt me a lot. It's going to hurt me not just in terms of economics standpoints. It's going to hurt me with the Mexican government. So Austin went as far as personally leading the Austin Colony's militia alongside Mexican officials to put down the Fredonian Rebellion. So it's a failure. It dramatically fails, but it does send a clear message to the Mexican government. American immigration just might be a real danger for Mexico and for Texas specifically. So the thought is starting to get implanted. Maybe we need to rethink the whole idea of the impresario system and Anglo immigration, excuse me. For Texans, it implants a whole different sentiment. For Texans' parts, for Texas's part, excuse me, in the part of Anglo-Texans, they became incredibly distrustful of Mexico's government, especially when Mexico's government, in punishment over all of this, told Hayden Edwards that your impresario grant, null and void, and we're reabsorbing it. So he lost everything as a consequence of this. And for Texans, it wasn't so much that Mexico took the land back and said your impresario grant is null and void. That was bad for them. They didn't like that. But more importantly, Mexico did it without a trial or anything like that. And I'm not saying anything negative about the Mexican government. What I'm telling you is the Anglo-Texans' perception of this. The Anglo-Texans looked at this and said, well, they didn't even give him a trial. How, he didn't even get to defend himself. And, I'm sure that Mexico's answer to this was, you led a rebellion against us. There's no defense. You lose your land. So you've got these two sides now. You've got American-born colonists who are worried or claiming they're worried about due process. This is something that's going to get ingrained in the mythos of the Texas Revolution. When people start talking about why did Texas rebel, they're going to say, well, the court system was different. It wasn't something that Americans were used to. Well, that can be turned right around and say, well, Mexico had granted these people impresario titles, and they weren't really used to people leading rebellions against the government either. But in any event, this is the root of that argument that the court system was different and unfair. Now, to try to reevaluate and figure out a path forward, Mexico is going to send a general named Manuel de Mier y Terán, the guy pictured on the screen here. He was a high-ranking officer in the Mexican military and a civil engineer. He's going to go into Texas in 1828 to report on the goings-on, to see if he can come up with some basic ideas about what the status is and what should we do going forward. Mier y Terán did not paint a good picture. He reported that Texas was, quote, flooded with Anglos, and that Nacogdoches was, for all practical purposes, an American town, not a Mexican town, and that there was very little prospect for Nacogdoches to actually assimilate into Mexican culture. He also reported that Anglos generally disobeyed or simply disregarded colonization laws. Mier y Terán went back to Mexico City, concluding that the lack of immigrant loyalty had to be dealt with immediately, or Mexico would need to come to terms with the idea of losing Texas. So he's talking in 1828, and I mentioned that as a way of saying as early as 1828, that if we don't do something, we are going to lose Texas. So as a result of Mier y Terán's expedition here, Mexico is going to come up with some new laws. First, the law of April 6th, 1830. This is going to be the first part. This is going to create real problems for Texas empresarios. It's going to declare that incomplete contracts are null and void. Incomplete contracts are null and void. So guys who got empresario contracts who had not managed to bring in the required number of settlers, you lose your contract. Mier y Terán's enforcement allowed empresarios that had already brought in 100 families to continue settlement. Practically speaking, what this meant was that only Austin and I mentioned his name before, Green DeWitt, they were the only two empresarios left in Texas. They were the only ones who had managed to get more than 100 in. So they're the only ones who can legally bring settlers in. The law of April 6, 1830 also stated that any future American emigres must not settle in lands that bordered the United States. So if you're going to emigrate to Texas, you need to move a little bit further inland. It also stated, it established a whole new set of presidios, a whole new set of presidios. Now, strangely enough, these new presidios are actually going to be staffed by convicts who are serving out their prison sentence. So they're told, you can either remain in prison or you can finish out the remainder of your term as a soldier in one of these presidios. So a lot of convicts jump at this, and that is, I don't want to make it sound like convicts are people who are convicted of crimes are in some level or on some level, bad news. However, you can also probably figure out that this doesn't represent a real commitment to staffing those presidios, or a serious commitment to staffing those presidios and holding on to Texas, if they're not willing, if the Mexican government is not willing to commit professional soldiers to this. Okay, so those convicts, I'm not attacking them as saying, well, they never should have done this, and these people are at the bottom level, but it's just not a serious commitment to those presidios. The presidio's job is the job of those at the presidios is going to be checking for illegal immigration. So they're basically the border patrol, except they're on the other side of the border this time. And finally, the law of April 6, 1830 unequivocally banned any further importation of slaves into Mexican Texas. Now, the president of Mexico at this point is Vicente Guerrero. We mentioned him already in this class. Vicente Guerrero had already acted on all of this stuff. On September 15th, 1829, Guerrero had already issued a directive abolishing slavery throughout all of Mexico. So I don't care if you remember the date, September 15th, 1829. The previous date, April 6th, you kind of do need to remember that. But September 5th, 1829, all you need to remember about that is this is when Mexico's government says, that's it, no more slavery. Guerrero abolishes slavery throughout Mexico. Now, he does it because he was worried that the immigration plan for Anglos had basically gone off the rails. And rather than directly confront Anglos by, like sending an army up or something like that, Guerrero thought that abolishing the immigrants' labor force, by doing that, Anglos would stop coming into Texas, and the problem of Anglo immigration would just go away. However, political resistance in places like Coahuila, and political resistance from the elites in Coahuila wound up convincing Guerrero that this is not going to work. And another decree has to be issued. And this new decree, while Guerrero did actually ban slavery in all of Mexico, he issues a subsequent order that exempts Coahuila y Tejas from the ban. Now, that's all well and good, but in April of 1830, just 7 months later, the entire ban of slavery in Texas is back on the table. That's why I'm mentioning these dates of September 15th, 1829, and April 6th, 1830. September 1829 and April of 1830. So you've got the nation on one date, September 15th, banning slavery. A few weeks later saying, okay, well, except Texas. Texas can have slavery. And then in April of 1830 saying, no more slavery. So real point of contention, got a lot of problems happening in Texas and with the Mexican government. Now, wrong button. The fight over slavery in Texas, once again, boiled down to liberals versus conservatives within Mexico. The leaders of the Liberal Federalist Party were instrumental in bringing the empresarios into Texas in the first place. So it made sense that these same leaders would support the empresarios in the late 1820s. These were people, the Federalists, the liberals, were the ones who said economic success depends on exemptions from taxes for cotton. It depends on foreign imports. It depends on free trade. They were giving citizenship to Americans like James Bowie, who brought in a plan and a permit for textile plants to create an internal market for cotton within Texas. All of these people believed that slave labor was necessary. Now, I know I'm using terms like liberal and conservative here, but take modern 21st century ideas about liberal and conservative and throw them out the window. We're not talking about capital L liberalism here. We're talking about small L, the idea about opening the economy, about making sure that everyone's able to participate in the economy. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with here when we talk about liberal. That's who is supporting slavery. Austin, meanwhile, Stephen F. Austin is mirroring what's going on in Coahuila. They too saw the future as cotton cultivation. They worked to legalize slavery. One of the early victories that Austin won was a decree passed in May of 1828. Let me move back here. May of 1828. This law validated the contracts of servitude that was made in foreign countries. So what this did, in short, emigres could actually come in to Texas with their, quote, servants. And by validating these contracts, what they basically did, what Austin said was, these people can come to Texas, and instead of calling them slaves, we're going to validate the enslaved as indentured servants who were bound to a term of service for 99 years. So it's not really getting rid of slavery. But that's how they're going to do this. The law validated the contracts of servitude made in foreign countries. To make this work within the law, the Texas delegate to the state legislature of Coahuila y Tejas, a guy named Jose Antonio Navarro, sponsored a bill that allowed colonists to bring slaves into Texas as, quote, permanently indentured servants. Now, this is a weird thing. You might wind up engaging in conversations like this, where there are people who talk about Texas in, again, these very mythological ways, and they will tell you that slavery, quote, did not exist in Texas after Guerrero passed issued that edict in 1829, with the exception for Texas granted. However, these people will tell you that Texas wound up solving that problem themselves. They didn't bring any slaves into Texas. They brought in indentured servants. But again, I'm going to use that phrase again, that the law that Jose Antonio Navarro sponsored, it called for bringing these people in as, quote, permanently indentured servants. Indentured servants, by definition, serve a limited time and then they're free. The time that they are serving the term of indenture is about paying back the cost of bringing them somewhere in the first place. So, for example, in early U.S. history, we've got a number of indentured servants, poor people from England coming over to the United States and working off the cost of their transport to the American colonies. Well, it's meant to be temporary. There's no such thing as permanent indentured servitude. A permanent indentured servitude, one who is bound to service for life, is what we call a slave. So while these people may have this love of Texas and this belief that Texas is God's country and all of these sorts of things, this notion that slavery was not a big part of Texas is utter nonsense and utter garbage. Now, this is where we're going to stop today, because what we're going to be dealing with next, and what we're going to put up next week, is stuff that is about the resistance to the law of April 6th, 1830. It is that resistance to the law of April 6th, 1830 that is going to set Texas towards secession and independence from Mexico. It is going to once again plunge Mexico into a deep internal crisis. It is also going to create a 9-year period where the United States is constantly trying to annex Texas, which is going to set the United States against Mexico. Because while Mexico technically agrees to allow Texas separation from Mexico, as soon as that happens, as soon as the treaty is, quote, signed, or the order is signed, the Mexican Congress almost immediately rescinds it because they say it was done under duress. So they don't recognize Texas's true independence. That means that there are going to be 3 participants in the fight next week, our closing week, by the way. There are going to be 3 participants in that fight. The United States of America, Estados Unidos de America, the, quote, Republic of Texas, and the United States of Mexico, Estados Unidos de Mexico. So we're going to have 3 participants fighting. They're all going to be they're all going to be part of a big war, and it's all going to culminate in some huge implications for both the United States and for Mexico. So that's what we're going to close with next week. See you next time around.